You're listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. My name is Nick Norbrook. I hope you're all well. I hope you're keeping yourself and your loved ones safe wherever you are. We have a paywall coming on the africareport.com. Times change, business models evolve, and ours is finally jumping onto the big digital wagon. We'll be offering you, our loyal podcast listeners, a special discount, so stay tuned in the weeks to come. Head to theafricareport.com to sign up to the best of our journalism daily for free. On the podcast this week, America is back. The President, Joe Biden, says so. But what will this mean in practice for Africa? Invest Africa recently held a webinar on the subject, moderated by myself, which we're very happy to be able to replay for you here. Now, things are already moving along quickly. President Biden, has issued a flurry of executive orders that matter especially for Africa. He's rescinded the travel ban, allowing people from, for example, Nigeria to travel to the US. He's making it easier for students to come to the US. The US has rejoined the Paris Climate Deal and the World Health Organization, and it won't be quitting the World Trade Organization. Importantly, President Biden has signed the US up to COVAX, the global scheme to underwrite vaccine provision for low-income countries. So that's all good news, of course, but it does resemble a boat adrift in the middle of the ocean, which had capsized. Biden may have righted the vessel, but what next? What course will he chart for US-Africa relations? Greater than that, this is a US president who wants to fight climate change, he wants to fight a pandemic, he wants to fix US democracy. So how much bandwidth will he have for Africa, which traditionally, let's be honest, sits low on the agenda? What element of Trump's economic diplomacy will be carried over? What opportunities will African partners seek in the US now that it's run by Biden officials? And will Biden reverse the decision over Western Sahara, for example? I'm going to level with you. I have no idea. That's why Invest Africa thoughtfully provided us with a stellar panel to answer the tough questions. Amaka Anku of Eurasia Group, Aubrey Hruby of the Atlantic Council, Judd of the Center for Global Development, and Judd Devermont from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Judd, I introduced you last, but I want to start with you as I have a subject that's both strategic and international, and I know you've been studying it. Let's get straight into the substantial issues. We can do the mood music of the administration later. I'd like to talk about US-China relations and what it means for Africa. For what it's worth, when I quizzed the former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair about what the dozen or so heads of state he advises in Africa are worried about, number one for them was navigating this relationship between the US and China. It's hard, as South Africa discovered. You want good relationships with both countries, and that's become difficult. The 5G decisions are a case in point. And there does seem to be some agreement across the aisle in the House and across America Inc. that the last few decades have not been particularly good for the US. Unfair tariffs, industrial espionage, aggressive licensing agreements, anti-competitive dumping, the list goes on. Biden's just come out with some US first style procurement plan, which sounds suspiciously like America first. What do you think might really change in terms of that relationship? What does it mean for Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And thanks so much to Invest Africa for having me here. Let's start with where President Biden agrees with President Trump when it comes to China. And Tony Blinken, who is his nominee for the Secretary of State, during his hearing said this is something that President Trump got right. He got right thinking about China in an adversarial framework. But I think that there are some tonal changes and there are going to be some spaces for a divergence from the Trump administration. I don't think this is going to be as hawkish of a policy towards China in at least Africa. And I don't think it will be as zero sum, as several of the Biden, Freudian slip, as several of the Biden administration officials have said, this is going to be about what America is for and not what it's against. But here's the things, at least when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, that I think you'll see the hard edge remain. First, cyber and tech. That has been, I think, a key strategic threat for both U.S. interests and for African sovereignty, even if many African governments don't take it as seriously. I think the Biden team will be focused on critical infrastructure access. What does it mean with ports, with space programming, et cetera? And then they'll take a hard look at how China's relationships with sub-Saharan African countries elevated within multilateral institutions, whether that's undermining broad principles around democracy or human rights, or just taking the U.S. down a peg or limiting the U.S.'s ability to push its interests. Now, some of our friends may think that's a little too rosy, but I do think that there's fairly good evidence to show that. Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, wrote in a Foreign Affairs article that they're going to focus on clear-eyed coexistence on terms favorable to U.S. interests and values. Tony Blinken, made this comment in the hearing that, yes, it's adversarial, but we're also going to find some places to cooperate. And I think what they're implying here is, particularly around climate change and on vaccines, or not vaccines, I should say the pandemic and global health issues. So that's different than where the Trump folks are. Just a couple places, Nick, that I think that we should be really looking at in terms of where do we see this really hit the road, where the rubber hits the road. In West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, these are countries where there is real popular frustration with Chinese activities, whether it's illegal fishing or illicit mining, or some of the ways that factory owners are discriminatory towards African workers. And that's being raised by publics, I think genuinely, and then raised by oppositions opportunistically. And so how the U.S. is going to navigate that space will be really interesting. In Central and Southern Africa, Beijing has really close ties with the South African ruling party and with Namibia. But again, these are democracies. We see civil society raising issues about Chinese programming or projects, particularly when they're environmental or there's bribery involved. And then what are they going to do with Zambia and Angola, where debt is a huge issue? And then finally, and this is a continuity with the Trump administration, is Kenya, particularly around the SGR, the Bechtel Road, and then with the FTA, what the U.S. will do with the free trade agreement, and how does that compare to this Continental Free Trade Agreement or what China has done in a place like Mauritius. So I'm going to stop there, but I would say just two things that I'm really excited to see if they can actually fulfill their promise on. And I know Gyude and Aubrey care about this a lot, which is how does the U.S. reinvent and reimagine its soft power? Two, what do we think about our education programming? And then three, can we really think about Africans in a multilateral setting, not just as votes that you need to whip at the end of the day, but as really important voices to push on some of our shared interests?
Just to pick up on one of your earlier points about tech being an area where there'll be some engagement, the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, has been getting closer to the US in recent months. Many of the materials that will power the next phase of the global economy as it moves into more electricity and less carbon-based forms of energy are going to be coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. How will this very close relationship between, for example, the Tshisekedi's predecessor, Joseph Kabila, and Chinese mining interests in the country be navigated by Biden and by Western companies who may want to alter the status quo in terms of some of the contracts, some of the tax licensing regimes?
Do you want me to try that hard question, or does Aubrey want to jump in?
I mean, Judd, have a swing, and then Aubrey, you can fix it.
Well, I think that the Biden team is going to focus, just as the Obama did, on sort of the environmental standards and regulatory rules to ensure that there isn't abuse of workers, and that ultimately may inhibit the ability of U.S. companies to compete in the way that the Chinese do. It is true that Tshisekedi is close to the U.S. government, and I think that will continue under President Biden, in part because Tshisekedi now is going to actually have the ruling party behind him, given the votes in the National Assembly, and he'll be the head of the AU. So a number of reasons why that relationship should continue. But I think that the mining sector is particularly difficult because it is important to batteries and cell phones, et cetera. I haven't seen, American companies have had a hard time operating in this space, and I'm not sure they're going to be able to be successful, but I hope someone's going to disprove me. Aubrey,
jump in there.
Well, I think there is an effort to rethink supply chains after the COVID crisis and to think about strategic supply chains as well. We do see some legislation going through Congress that was drafted before all the drama of the last few months, second impeachment, insurrection, this kind of thing. And so you did see a pressure to see how supply chains can be decoupled from the China story. And for example, China refines 80% of the world's graphite. Graphite goes into batteries, for example. So, I do think African countries have a role to play in a strategic reshaping of supply chains. But I think it will be kind of a Europe-US approach. That you even see being mimicked in India and Japan as they look to do the exact same thing, is to reshore supply chains in strategic areas. If anything, this effort is nascent at best. But African countries, I think there's an opportunity for the U.S. to engage with critical African countries on it. But it's not just Congo, actually. If you look at the distribution of lithium or graphite, Mozambique's a huge producer of graphite. And so lithium, even DRC, outside of DRC, Cote d'Ivoire has some. So it's outside of DRC. I do think the issues around conflict minerals will remain, and concerns around, the human rights abuses that have been in some of the supply chain that make traceability very difficult. Especially for those minerals coming out of Eastern Congo. So it doesn't make the problem, even though there's this strategic impetus, the actual execution will be plagued by all kinds of challenges from a compliance perspective.
Jude, please do pick up any of those points that you wanted to, but also I'd like to tack on to the end of that, if I might. They say in Washington that personnel is policy, or rather, you told me that when we were preparing. So what do the personnel choices that have been made or haven't been made tell us about Biden's potential policy choices ahead, and how does that tie into any of these issues that we've been discussing?
Sure. So I think of what Aubrey was talking about, I think for the U.S. and U.S. companies, we see that, for example, in the U.K., I think it's by 2030, they're going to phase out ICE cars. And for all across Europe, between 2035 and 2045, most countries are going to be using completely electric cars. And these strategic minerals that are sort of abundant in some countries in Africa will be really, really crucial. However, a significant amount of those deposits rights to those deposits are owned by Chinese companies, right? And China has continued to expand there. So I think for the US and Europe, it will probably be working with India or Turkey, because in my experience, the Indians and the Turkish have been capable of operating in those environments, almost as capable as the Chinese. And so where the Western firms can't, they'll probably partner with Indian and Turkish firms to be able to do that. I think there's an opportunity for that to happen there. In terms of the Biden administration, we were waiting with breath abated and just about who would be in charge of Africa policy, right? Because like you said, personnel is policy is an indication of the seriousness that attached to a portfolio. We saw under the Trump administration that, almost 2 years in, almost half of the countries on the continent didn't have an ambassador. And the top role in the U.S. government for Africa policy, the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, that position was either occupied by a temporary official or unoccupied for almost 2 years. So, but we've seen that the Biden administration is going in a completely different direction. So one is we have people who have made a career in Africa in high positions in the U.S. government already, even if we don't see who the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs will be. So Linda Thomas-Greenfield, a good friend of ours, most people here, she was ambassador to Liberia when I was in the government in Liberia, and then she became Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. So it's someone who's built a career on Africa policy. She's at the UN and she's on the president's cabinet. We have Susan Rice. She's doing domestic policy, but she's in the White House and she's done Africa policy. We have Linda Etim, and now we have Dana Banks, who is a Foreign Service officer. Her last posting was in South Africa. She's going to be the Senior Director for Africa on the National Security Council. So it looks as if the Biden administration, just by indication, simply, it's not just, not being Trump. It shows that the Biden administration is putting pretty competent people in place. And even Samantha Power, who goes to USAID, has some interest in Africa. The final thing I would say, as we wait to see if Judd is going to be the next Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, as we wait to see who's appointed to that position, I think we look at Congress too. You see that in the Senate Foreign Affairs Commission, the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs. What is it called? Senate Foreign
Relations.
Foreign Relations.
Foreign Affairs.
The House is Foreign Affairs. That's right. We have Senator Bob Menendez, who has been a champion of Africa, has taken significant interest in the continent, and then as chair, and then in the House, we have Representative Gregory Meeks, who's also been a champion of Africa. So we see both in the U.S. Congress and across the Biden administration, we see personnel, we see people who are open to the idea of more substantive relations between the U.S. and the continent. So for us, obviously Judd would be the icing on the cake, but, we're looking to see who the Biden administration selects to be the top official on Africa.
Nick, just, aside from Gyude's one-man campaign, one of the things that I would note is we're already seeing a lot more public engagement from this administration on Africa. The State Department spokesman has tweeted several times now about Uganda during the campaign. We saw Blinken and President Biden talk about Ethiopia. I haven't done the math yet, but we may have more public statements on Africa in the first week than we've had, for a huge percentage of the time under Trump. So that's all good signs. This is an administration that is going to talk about Africa and that is going to stand up for human rights and democracy and governance issues.
And the diaspora. I don't think we can neglect the diaspora issues and elements of forming policy. The Biden-Harris campaign put out a statement to the diaspora, and many of us were involved in some of the diaspora kind of working groups and fundraisers that existed during the campaign. And I think that, I was told then that the African diaspora raised more for the Biden campaign than any other region or any other diaspora. So, and you see even on their website, they have a statement on Africa diaspora. I think where that intersects with the other policy areas of import is around education. We know that African students are a very important economic driver, not only for African countries in terms of high earners and remittances, but for the U.S. as well. They create lots of jobs while here, they're consuming things while here, and then they build those people-to-people ties that we build on for generations after.
Thank you very much. And for all of you who are wondering what this hip new acronym was, an ICE car is an internal combustion engine. Is that right, Jude? Thanks. And it's worth saying that, as you mentioned, Tony Menendez, I think he made some very strong comments about the election campaign that Museveni was waging on his opponent, if you can call it a campaign. Amaka, there is, of course, the awful problem for all administrations, and that is the tyranny of the present, the tyranny of what has to happen right now. And Ethiopia, of course, seems very urgent right now. An ongoing security operation in the north of the country, involving troops from Eritrea, sucking in Sudan perhaps, pulling troops away from Somalia just weeks ahead of an election. And of course, we were talking about the diaspora just now, a huge Ethiopian, huge and very vocal diaspora from Ethiopia in the US. What is the thinking on what the Biden administration will prioritize? Will it be sucked into Ethiopia? How will they manage to share out the bandwidth?
Thanks, Nicholas. I don't have any intelligence on what they will prioritize. I'm sure Judd and Aubrey maybe, but I will tell you that what I hope they will prioritize over the course of the administration is that I hope it will not just focus on security concerns, which I think every U.S. government, there's always, that's always going to be a focus. That's fair. But I do hope that the Biden administration will move beyond kind of just thinking about security or human rights issues. Yes, doing that better than Trump. But also, I would hope taking a leading voice in kind of framing how the world, and in particular American businesses, should be thinking about Africa as a strategic opportunity, right? I think that one of the biggest failings of the Trump administration is that there was no coherent kind of strategic approach to even like thinking about what place Africa, should take in the world. And there was a lot of misunderstanding about kind of, even ongoing conflict. So I would hope that there is kind of a broader strategic approach in terms of approaching this as an economic opportunity, building on some of the things that the Obama administration did, Power Africa, so on and so forth. And then I would say, and then I would even go further and say that I would love to see the administration and other leading voices in the U.S. take a role in framing the role, the fact that states in Africa need to take a very important role in driving development, right? I think that's something that often gets lost in the narrative of markets and free trade and because no country in the world, right? No real country in the world, except for some offshore destinations, has developed just by opening up and liberalizing and just allowing markets to run wild, right? And I think that that's something that a lot of people look to the U.S. in terms of framing, and it would be even for African intellectuals on the continent, I think it would be compelling if there is a voice that is acknowledging that the state needs to play a very important role in providing public infrastructure. The state needs to play a very important role in providing government services. That often means larger and better state services, not smaller state services, right? Anyway, so I can go on about this, and it has implications for the AFCFTA, for example, right? Like if the framing around AFCFTA is that, we're going to liberalize trade, that's never going to get us anywhere, because there's nothing, most of these African countries don't have that much to trade. They're not manufacturing anything, they're not producing stuff, right? And so to me, the focus really has to be on how do we support production, right? What does that mean in terms of incentivizing businesses to orient externally? And what role can we play in supporting states in doing that, right? And then what role can the U.S. play in investing in these businesses and so on and so forth. So I mean, that's something that I would hope to see over the course of the next 4 years.
Thanks very much, Amaka. And that actually allows me to... Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add to what Amaka was talking about. I think quickly, I hope we can see something happen with the Western Sahara and definitely also with Ethiopia. You saw that with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, that the Trump administration actually entered that conflict on the side of Egypt. Right, the Trump administration recognized Morocco's claims in the Western Sahara. One hopes that as the Biden administration, I agree with Amaka that it shouldn't be shaped solely by security, but that those things that the Trump administration managed to destabilize, that the Biden administration would actually pay attention to them. Sorry, Nick.
I think what I'd like to do is put a pin in the discussion on security and come back to it in a second. There was actually a question from the floor about the chances, what the chances might be for the Okonjo-Iweala nomination from the Biden administration as the head of the WTO. Now, to your point, Amaka, do you think it will help to have someone with a deep knowledge of many economies across the continent at the head of the global body, which is meant to push for more liberalized global trade? Do you think there is a tension there?
Actually, I don't. I do think it helps. I mean, again, so the other side of what I just said is that no country has also ever developed without trade, right? So it is important. It's just that there's a necessary sequencing and there's a necessary, I would say, appreciation of the need for some protection of infant industries, right? And so I do think that having somebody like Okonjo-Iweala at the head of the WTO is very important, not only because she understands, I would hope she understands that dynamic in terms of where you can use some smart industrial policies, but also because of the learning that will flow from it, right? You would have a whole bunch of, I would hope, new African intellectuals who work with Okonjo-Iweala or work at the WTO, who learn kind of the intricacies of kind of trade remedies and issues, and she will be a powerful voice in terms of pushing what that means for things like the AFCFTA or just trade issues, right? That's one of the problems I would say that we have, is that a lot of people don't really understand how trade enforcement works and so on and so forth. So I do think it will help to have somebody from Africa who deeply understands the issues on the continent in the largest trade body, not just because she understands, but also it helps with learning. It helps with learning for other officials on the continent.
Aubrey, maybe we could move into the economic side of things then. The Democrats, I mean, let's be honest, they're not known for, really engaging with the continent on economic matters. That tends to be something that Republicans do. The Trump administration did push some initiatives. They created this new development finance corporation with a decent budget. I think it's $40 or $50 billion. 60 billion. What's a few tens of billions between friends? They have the Prosper Africa initiative, which I think still is still moving along. They got the Exim Bank back on its feet. So is there a possibility then, if you had, for example, an Okonjo-Iweala at the WTO able to educate on a slightly smarter take on globalization, and you had a Biden administration willing and able to take forward some of these more successful economic policies that emerged over the last 4 years, is that too rosy a picture I'm painting?
Well, listen, I think that you're absolutely right that under the Trump administration, because of a perception of a need to globally compete with China, we resurrected and strengthened all of our commercial tools of policy. So from XM to OPIC, which became the DFC, which is our development finance institution, we now have all of these tools that are there and primed and ready to go. And Prosper Africa's aim, though it's not a sexy one immediately, is to coordinate and make sure that those tools are working in concert and that American investors can actually access those tools and use them readily. And so there is a lot of forward momentum that I hope the Biden administration keeps. So, for example, Prosper Africa has announced through USAID an open RFP right now to try to facilitate, it's a $500 million program to facilitate trade and investment into African markets, recognizing that American investors, because of distance, because of historical disconnection, may need more support in seizing and seeing opportunities in African markets than, say, European or Asian investors. And so I think we are in the right direction. And the question is does the Biden administration add fuel to that effort? Or do they slow it down with a lot more requirements on, say, a civil society, human rights, or democratic regime kind of perspective, or they double down on commercial policy? So I would hope that there's a strengthening of commercial policy when it comes to African markets. And right now, the momentum is good. And so I think that African countries are eager to see that investment come. And the question is, are American investors in this era of a COVID shutdown, in a COVID recessionary environment, really looking for opportunities abroad? And time will tell. African countries like Kenya, for example, are slated to bounce back to growth at like 6% this year, which is incredible. So, and Egypt, for example, hasn't even during the Arab Spring, even during the COVID period, has never gone into recession. They're still growing at 2%. Despite all of these headwinds. So you still have resilience and an economic growth story that should attract increasing investment.
Aubrey, there's a question that I'd like you to answer from the floor as well, just as we speak about these issues of protection of industry. Someone saying that it's particularly important when it comes to digital payments and digital commerce. Do you have a comment on that? There's obviously been the purchase of Paystack by the US payments giant Stripe in the middle of last year. It's a particularly significant moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure protection, I understand the question per se. Obviously, digital payments and digital commerce are a huge growth area for the region. You see of all kind of asset classes, venture capital, even during COVID, stayed on track and grew to some extent. Over $1 billion was raised for African venture last year, while private equity and other asset classes dramatically shrunk because of the COVID recession. So really, in digital payments and fintech has been just the brightest area of that space. Almost 45% of all the venture raised is going into that area. And it's an area where there is a lot of US African overlap of interest. You have Google and Facebook both backing undersea cables right now to increase the broadband access. You have Alphabet and SpaceX both doing pilots on internet solutions that could be applied to African markets to deal with lack of consumer access and cheap data issues. So those things, I think, are coming online in an area where there's a lot of US-Africa shared interest.
Absolutely. Jude, do you think there is a smart way of pulling together economic interests and security issues to sort of grab the attention of DC and focus it on important issues? Because obviously, if there used to be a joke going around that if you wanted to get anyone in DC to pay attention to anything in Africa, you just had to write China in the proposal, and suddenly you'd get millions of dollars of financing. Is there a way? Because I know you're interested in building some kind of cross-party or sort of alliance of like-minded institutions to help inform and nudge US policy towards the continent in DC. To what extent would security be one of the tools in your toolkit to do that?
Yeah, so in defense of the Democrats and the private sector, we have to see the tools of US foreign policy in Africa as incremental over time. So AGOA was a piece of that. Power Africa was a piece of that. Prosper Africa adds to that. And there's an opportunity for the Biden administration to be able to build on the foundation that has already come before and be able to expand it. And I think, to your question, that U.S. policy in Africa has been exercised primarily by two things: risk and prestige. on the question of risk, Africa hasn't really been core to U.S. economic interests. And so when the U.S. looked at Africa, it's been through the prism of what risks emerging from there could threaten the U.S. core interests. And so it mainly was security and maybe health, right? So after the USS Cole, the bombings in Eritrea and the bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, U.S. security interests began to dominate this conversation, and now including the Sahel. And then after Ebola, global health surveillance became a big thing. So it's possible to continue to talk about, especially on global health, because we've seen what happens when a global health crisis gets out of control, so that the things that were considered core are threatened by that. But I think going forward, the argument we're making, at least me and my colleagues on here, is that the reason why U.S. economic interests in Africa are where they are is a direct result of policy. If the U.S. dedicated more resources to its policy toward Africa, that would change. If the U.S. government began to talk about Africa being a place where U.S. businesses should focus, then the U.S. businesses are going to pay attention to that. But if the only thing coming out of the U.S. policymakers every time a U.S. official arrives in Africa is berating Africans for being corrupt, I mean, then what kind of American business wants to do business in a place where everybody is corrupt, right? So just before now, we were talking about Samantha Power at USAID, and one of the things that's going to be a big deal is corruption. I'm not saying that corruption is not an issue, but I would make this example. In Liberia, we did a growth diagnostic paid for by the U.S. government. What was the binding constraint to economic growth? And it turns out it wasn't corruption. It wasn't as if corruption wasn't a problem. The binding constraint to economic growth, it found out from the diagnostic, was lack of infrastructure, power, and roads. And so it makes sense. We're definitely open to talking about human rights and security and stuff. But the way we guarantee security is by growing the economic pie. The final thing I would say to that is that between 2001 and 2019, the U.S. government has already spent more than $6 trillion on global war on terror. Can you imagine if $1 trillion of that had gone into economic infrastructure around the world and not gone into, bombs? You can imagine that the Chinese BRI is only $1 trillion, and the U.S. has spent 6 times more than that over the last 20 years. So I think as we build a coalition, the argument we're making is that if U.S. policy backed by resources in Africa, Africa itself can become core to U.S. economic interests.
Thank you. Judd, do you think that's unfair, that characterization, that tension between security and the attention that the US pays to Africa?
Yeah, I think there's 2 parts here. First, I 100% agree with Gyude that we have a challenge in the way that we talk to Americans about economic opportunities in Africa. One, I think sort of the negative stories around corruption or security or insecurity get in the way. But I don't think we're very innovative in the way that we even talk about the opportunities. So if you look at the history of the way that U.S. has talked about the private sector in Africa, at least since the 70s, it's been about demographic growth or these sort of extractive minerals. And in the last 2 decades, it's been about fastest growing economies. And yet the numbers haven't changed. So I do think there's some challenges in the way that we talk to Americans, right? I don't think we use the kinds of images and stories, statistics that actually would get people to not just invest in Africa, but to decide that they'd rather invest in Africa than Vietnam or their hometown. And sometimes that's the challenge of the U.S. policymaker, that we talk about African investments in a silo as if you aren't making choices. If you're going to invest in Africa, you're not going to invest in somewhere else. So I think, one, it's a messaging thing. It's having a more honest conversation. That doesn't mean you don't talk about corruption, because that would be disingenuous, right? But to talk about the challenges and the opportunities in a new way. But I want to go back to this point that Amaka raised when we talked about the inbox and the focus on security. And I think this is really relevant when it comes to investment, because we kind of have to eat our, have our cake and eat it too, right? You can't, I don't think these are verticals, right? It's not like a security and an economic and a development and a democracy and government. And I think I've been in government and I've seen people try to elevate one or the other, and I don't think that works. And here's a great example, Ethiopia, right? We can talk about Ethiopia in terms of a serious security challenge that is problematic both for Ethiopians, for the region, for Europe, for the Middle East. But we can also talk about, what does this mean for the business community that is very excited about the Ethiotel privatization really a crown jewel. And yet you've got a government that shuts it down periodically for a whole host of reasons. So these aren't disconnected, that the opportunities in Africa also mean working really hard on some of the security impediments.
Absolutely. Aubrey, before we go to my question on US small businesses investing in Africa or mid-sized businesses investing in Africa, I would like to stay with you, Judd, and just ask about some of the security concerns across the Sahel. These are not new. There is intense drying that has happened over the last 20 years. You've had old practices whereby herders in the Sahelian areas often take their cattle down towards greener pastures. These are now triggering serious conflicts in Nigeria. You have contraband and smuggling activities mixing with Islamist activities. You have militia split into many hundreds of small militia outfits. You have very limited state capacity to tackle them, these interlocking security concerns. They normally happen around the borders of countries where the reach of the state is at its weakest. You have a relatively unpopular French military presence. And recently, the signs were that the US was going to disengage from this part of the world. You have the more hysterical commentators talking about the creation of the next Afghanistan. I'm sure you're not one of those. But what might we expect from a US government that was taking this seriously? What would you like to see happen in the Sahel in terms of US engagement?
Yeah, Nick, thanks. A lot of questions. I don't have all of the answers, but I think it's first important just to start from where we were, which is everyone thought at the beginning of the Trump administration that these guys would be hardcore on security, that they'd be a counterterrorism policy towards Africa. And right, it's been the opposite. Tried to cut UN missions, pull out troops, which they just did in Somalia, the 700 troops there. They have been trying to pull out troops from the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, about 10%, but the ambition was more. And there are really big issues. So the Sahel, that which you mentioned, but Somalia continues to be a problem, and the emerging threat in northern Mozambique, which threatens a huge LNG find. I've already talked about, or briefly we've talked about, Ethiopia. So here's the first question, which is, how do you see the threats in the Sahel or in other parts of Africa affecting U.S. interests? The Trump team actually decided it didn't ultimately. Their view, at least for the Sahel, was it's a European problem. Now, I think you can talk about threats to the homeland in one category, and then you can talk about threats to economic investments, to U.S. personnel and facilities, to the cost of inaction, to our partnerships both with Africans, Europeans, et cetera, and have a more, I think, broader view of what insecurity means in the continent, let alone, the humanitarian costs of it. So if the Biden team says yes, that this is important, and I hope they do, then they've got some more important questions around, or secondary questions around policy. Will they put DOD back on a leash, which is what the Obama administration did, right? Everything that they did had to be approved in an interagency process. Trump reversed that. Are they really going to invest in defense institutions, which the Obama team had some policies around it, but didn't get much traction? Will they reduce their support for autocratic regimes, or decide that there's a trade-off here? You work with Deby, you work with Museveni, and you turn a blind eye to the way they treat their people. How are you going to focus on, or how are you going to partner with the French, a key partner in this region, but we probably have some differences on how we see the solutions for the Sahel. And then I think there's a whole set of issues around how do we communicate better to the American public and to Congress about what we're doing. Friends of mine at the Center for the New American Security had a great case study on Tonga Tonga in Niger, and I think illustrated that some of the term of arts that the U.S. government uses inside the Beltway to themselves are so arcane and nonsensical that you don't know what train equip actually means. So I think we have to change the language too. But those are the kind of things that I think if you decide, yes, it is important, which I do, then you have to really get into the efficacy question. and there's a whole set of things that you have to decide on following that.
Thank you very much. The Trump Republican Party had, that's the right word, had a vision of American carnage, Mexican rapists, Muslim bans, and it was all pretty ugly. Let's call a spade a spade. But perhaps this, nativist U.S. stance, perhaps it affected the decision making, certainly in terms of foreign policy, of various African governments across the continent. Amaka, do you think that's a possibility? Do you think the Trump era perhaps pushed various governments across the continent either into the arms of the Chinese or perhaps forced them to stand on their own 2 feet in terms of making deals with powers in the Gulf? Was this Trump era ever a good thing, counterintuitively?
I don't think, I guess to answer the first question, I don't think it had that much of an impact in terms of what, African governments would or would not have done in their relationships with China, right? I think sometimes we tend to overstate the importance of sort of, the U.S. policy stance in influencing individual African government, relationships, right? So I'm not sure that I don't think I would say that it's necessarily pushed people more towards China. But of course there is the reality that for many, many years, even before Trump, a lot of African governments just found that it was, easier to get financing from China for lots of big infrastructural projects that they thought was important for the development, right? And of course, there are lots of white elephant projects as well. But, so that's something that we've seen that preceded Trump and will probably continue, right? Because following. But I just wanted to add really quickly to what Judd was saying on climate. I do think that that an important element that just we haven't talked about yet on the climate side is also acknowledging there isn't a lot of acknowledgement in public discussions, even internally in these countries, the role that climate is playing in making all these conflicts worse, right? The fact that previously the Lake Chad is drying up. And historically, nomadic pastoralists are finding that it's very, very hard to feed their cattle. I think there's an opportunity here for the U.S. government and other partners to work with governments in elevating this issue and actively trying to find creative solutions, right? Like, it's fine to send troops. That's not going to solve the problem because you're going to continue having more and more pastoralists with no grass for their cattle, and they will continue to run into farmers, and it will continue to feed conflicts. And we need to think about, encouraging and supporting governments in finding other creative solutions like ranching, right? These kinds of things have become extremely politically sensitive across the Sahel because of other ethnic issues and tensions, and it's very difficult for some of these governments to try to solve the issue because then they get accused of favoring one ethnic group over the other, and yet it is absolutely necessary for the state to help find a creative solution to the reality that some of these nomadic practices are just no longer feasible in the current climate. Anyway, so I just wanted to throw that in there. I do think that that's something we all need to be acknowledging, because not enough people are acknowledging that there is a real, real kind of actual impact of the climate change threat right now in the Sahel.
Absolutely. Aubrey, if we could change tack a little bit and focus on some of the nuts and bolts of investing and some of the things that really matter for businesses who want to trade with Africa. And we mentioned the AFCFTA earlier. First of all, there are a lot of small companies, medium-sized companies in the US who actually would find some fantastic opportunities in Africa, and yet there's just very little done in terms of marketing those opportunities and connecting them. And I think on the flip side, there are many countries on the continent who have very easily packageable products which could easily be sold in the US. Do you think the Biden administration will take time to make it easier for trade between various African countries and the US? And what do you make of attempts? There have already been some in the Prosper Africa initiative, I know, but attempts to market African opportunity to US investors who are not in that bulge bracket class.
Yeah, and I think this is an area we all care a lot about. And as Judd mentioned, American entities, and there's research on this compared to Chinese entities, tend to see Africa through a lens of risk first, rather than a lens of opportunity first, which is what the Chinese tend to report. And so we have to address that framing and that visioning in order to get kind of a broader funnel of interested parties. American SMEs are a good fit for African opportunities because, for example, there are only about 450 companies on the continent that do over $1 billion in revenue. And an American SME is usually around slightly less than $1 billion. So there's a good fit between American-sized, middle-sized companies and African opportunities. The aim of Prosper Africa is to do exactly this, to try to reach these entities with, reverse road shows, with, the Judd was working on project focused on American cities and the industries that sit in those cities. So whether it's healthcare in Miami, the venture space in San Francisco, so trying to mobilize sector by sector, because that's what we learned from Power Africa. Power Africa, with very little resources, created a lot of interest because it was a sector focus.
Absolutely. Jude, in terms of the framing of opportunity on the continent, what do you think would help change the calculus?
Thank you. I just did a piece for Quartz Africa that was based off a Twitter thread I did, and one of the things that I noted was that an area in which the U.S. has a significant advantage is higher education, and in Africa there's a great need for that. Right. And so one of the proposals that I made was, U.S. universities that have Africa campuses. Right. So and an example I give is with Carnegie Mellon out of Pittsburgh that has a campus now in Rwanda. So that, and beyond that, they have a tech incubator on campus for students who are getting degrees and wanting to create these. And this is an area in which the U.S. currently has significant impact. And Aubrey's talked about this a lot. But the second thing is just the creative space. We have African artists who are now collaborating with U.S. artists. We're seeing the expansion in these online platforms that require content, and Netflix expanding into Africa. And I think there are areas in which the U.S. has these strengths. And if the federal government can begin to link African opportunities to American businesses that are here, especially at the small and mid-sized level that Aubrey was talking about, I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of being able to do that. The final thing that I would say, though, is that we can talk all of this. Infrastructure remains a significant need on the continent. And as I noted in my piece, it is going to be really, really hard for U.S. diplomats to do their work and do it effectively without addressing what is the primary need in a place like Africa. And I think that's where the Chinese have done really, really well in terms of the infrastructure question. So one hopes that going forward, especially on the economic front, we will begin to see an American response to what the Chinese have done in infrastructure.
And maybe really focused on digital infrastructure, whereas in America,
that's
area
true.
where American companies have a lot of expertise. I think on the question of trade, we still have AGOA in place. So those African exporters who want to export to the United States can under duty-free, quota-free terms. And that's in place till 2025. And I think there will be an effort to work with this Biden administration, and Congress has already said they want to find ways to support the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I think there's an effort to kind of figure that out. But at least until 2025, African exporters can export to the U.S. duty-free, quota-free. Of course, there's phytosanitary rules, but USAID really do, through the trade hubs and other regional programs, have efforts to make it easier to get products certified. I did see one question, Nick, about vaccine, and we started before even the webinar talking about it. I do think 2021 will be defined by the term vaccine inequality. It'll be defined by that internal in the United States domestically, as we see racial lack of access to vaccines, and then also globally as countries use their resources to kind of stockpile enough doses. So, vaccine inequality is going to be a defining factor in the next 2 years. And it's a race to see whether it's, Europeans or Chinese or the Russian vaccine or the American approaches that really take on kind of vaccine diplomacy once the crisis is on the right path in terms of vaccinating domestically. So I don't know who's going to take the lead. China has said a lot. FOCAC is coming up, so I expect them to say some things on this issue. They're a little ahead of the curve in terms of experiencing the second wave, as opposed to the U.S. But again, I think, as Gyude said, once Johnson & Johnson comes online, that could be a major game change for how the U.S. approaches vaccine distribution globally and Africa specifically.
So we are coming to an end of our time, sadly, but I'd like to ask you all to pick the one thing that you think the Biden administration is going to get right over the next 4 years, because who knows how many terms he'll get. But certainly in the next 4 years, what is the area you think they're going to score highly on? And I'll ask you first, Judd. No pressure.
Well, score highly depends on who's doing the scoring, right? I mean, I think they will be better on democracy and governance. I think that's clear. Not everyone's going to love that. In fact, if you look at polling on U.S. African views on the U.S., there was a precipitous drop under the Obama administration. I think in part because some of the issues that they would push for democracy and governance. So I'm going to score that high, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be a shared view depending on who you're talking to. What I think they're going to get right, and there's a little bit of hope here, and maybe not as much objective analysis, is urbanization. The administration, or during the campaign, the Biden team talked about creating an urbanization initiative. I think we are way past time to start reimagining the continent as an urban one, which it is and will be. In campaigns, statements that come from the candidate's mouth are law. And so it's one of the most binding things that they've said about Africa, actually. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what that is. I think there's lots of opportunities for the U.S. investors in the urban space. Clearly, COVID has shown the vulnerabilities in an urban environment. And there's a lot that we could be doing in terms of climate change and connecting Africa to the world through a smart urbanization program. So that's my vote.
Thank you very much. Amaka, your hope.
So I think what they will get right is just sort of a better understanding of the issues, right? And better framing of the issues. So, for example, I don't think we're going to see, Biden officials. I hope they don't frame Africa just as an afterthought in the Chinese policy, right? I hope that they don't. I think that they will do things better, like, Trump basically characterized land reform in South Africa as a land grab, violent land grab from white people, which was, totally an inaccurate narrative that was sold to them by white nationalists in South Africa. They've taken up this idea that there's a genocide against Christians in Nigeria, again, which is totally inaccurate, but was being pushed by certain people. So I think this is something I feel confident that they will get right. is just better understanding the actual issues and not being so gullible to sort of, very narrow, inaccurate narratives that are being lobbied by certain elements.
Thank you. Jude, what are they going to get right?
Well, two things. One is basically objective analysis, and the other is, like Judd, is driven more by hope. And then the objective one is, I think we've already seen that in most places, especially concerning Africa policy, you're going to have competent people who bring a wealth of experience to the position. So it's not going to be someone who's friends with the president's son-in-law or people with absolutely no background in an area being given big portfolios. So we're going to see the return of competence, especially when it comes to managing Africa policy. And I think they're going to get that right. The second thing is, I think the Biden administration has an opportunity that by the time the first term comes to an end, there will have to be a replacement economic framework for the relationship between the continent and the U.S. And I think what replaces AGOA is an opportunity that I hope to get right.
Fantastic. Aubrey, last word to you.
I think they'll get right the important role of the African diaspora in the U.S. I think we're going to see, you're already seeing the most diverse government being put together. You just look on the websites, you can see night and day difference between, racial and ethnic diversity, gender, the women coming into it. And you have, all the people that Gyude mentioned on shaping Africa policy happen to be women, for example. And so I do think you'll have, we have a very high profile Nigerian American at Treasury. I think you'll just see a lot of more integration and understanding of the role the diaspora plays for a competitive edge for the United States.
That's all for this week. Our thanks to our 4 speakers and to Invest Africa. You can sign up to a daily briefing of the Africa Report's best journalism for free. Head to theafricareport.com for more details. And please do remember to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nick Norbrook. Thanks for listening.